In a glittering hall filled with billionaires and royalty, laughter suddenly erupted. Not the kind born from joy, but cruel mockery. At the center of it all stood the son of a black cleaning lady, ridiculed by a powerful Arab millionaire who thought wealth gave him the right to belittle anyone beneath him. "What could a boy like you possibly know?" the millionaire sneered, certain he had won the crowd. But the room didn't know his secret. With a calm smile, the boy opened his mouth and spoke not in one language, but 9. The laughter froze. The millionaire's smirk vanished. And in that instant, respect shifted forever. The ballroom shimmered with golden chandeliers, their crystals catching the light like stars frozen in motion. The air smelled faintly of roses and expensive cologne, every detail of the evening tailored to radiate wealth, power, and exclusivity. It was the kind of gathering where billionaires compared business ventures like trading cards, and royalty mingled with CEOs as though they were equals. Everyone belonged to an elite circle, everyone except the boy and his mother. Her name was Grace Johnson, a black woman who worked quietly in the shadows of opulence. Every night, when the city's elite filled this marble-floored ballroom, she was there, not as a guest, but as the one who polished the glasses, folded the napkins, and ensured the rugs remained spotless beneath the polished shoes of the powerful. Grace moved like a whisper through these events, invisible to most, except when something needed to be fixed, and by her side that night was her son, Daniel Johnson, 17 years old. Unlike the guests, he wasn't draped in designer brands. His suit was second-hand, carefully pressed and slightly too big in the shoulders. But there was something about him, his steady posture, his sharp eyes, that didn't quite fit the role of the cleaner's son. He wasn't supposed to be there, not really. Grace had begged the event manager to allow him to help serve water at the tables, just for a little extra pay. For Daniel, the evening was more than just a chance to earn money. It was a glimpse into a world that seemed both dazzling and suffocating. The grand staircase, the marble floors, the foreign languages flowing like rivers around him, it all fascinated him. He listened closely as men from France, Italy, and Saudi Arabia carried conversations that others in the room barely understood. For Daniel, it was like music. Each word a note he recognized, each phrase a puzzle he could solve. Because while the world saw him as the cleaner's boy, Daniel carried a secret. He spoke not 1, not 2, but 9 languages fluently. Grace had always known her son was gifted. From the time he was little, he absorbed words like sunlight. While she worked 2 jobs, he buried himself in books from the local library. Spanish came first, then French, then German. Soon after, Arabic, Mandarin, and even Russian. Every language he mastered wasn't just an academic skill. It was his way of building a bridge to a world far larger than the one that tried to box him in. But to the people in that ballroom, Daniel was no different than his mother. Just another shadow. Someone meant to serve and disappear quietly. He knew that. Grace knew that. And for the most part, they accepted it. Still, there were moments, small cracks in the evening, when Daniel felt the sting of invisibility. As he passed glasses of water, conversation stopped when he walked by, as though his presence interrupted. Something delicate. Guests looked through him, not at him, eyes flickering briefly before settling back on people they deemed important. Grace, meanwhile, moved with her head lowered, never speaking unless addressed, carrying the weight of knowing her years of hard work had not earned her respect, only the bare minimum of tolerance. And yet, amidst the arrogance and indifference of the elite, there was always curiosity in Daniel's eyes. He never let their dismissal crush him. Instead, he absorbed every detail, the cadence of their conversations, the intricacies of their behavior, the subtle arrogance of their laughter. He understood these people in ways they couldn't begin to imagine. That night, the ballroom seemed louder than usual, buzzing with an unusual energy. Word had spread that Sheikh Omar Al-Fayed, a wealthy Arab businessman with holdings across the Middle East, would be attending. His name carried weight, whispered with reverence among the crowd. Some called him a visionary investor. Others called him ruthless. Everyone, however, agreed on one thing. He was powerful, and he knew it. When Sheikh Omar arrived, the air shifted. He wore a tailored suit that shimmered faintly under the chandeliers, his steps confident, his expression sharp and calculating. People swarmed him immediately, eager to shake his hand, to be seen in his orbit. His laughter boomed across the room, drawing attention like a spotlight. Daniel noticed him right away, not because of his wealth. Daniel had seen countless rich men stroll through these halls, but because of the way Omar looked at people. It wasn't with warmth or even acknowledgement. It was as if he were measuring them, deciding their worth before they had even spoken a word. Grace instinctively lowered her gaze when Omar passed, as though avoiding eye contact was a kind of survival. She had seen men like him before, the kind who thought money gave them the right to mock, belittle, and control. She whispered to Daniel to keep his head down and do his job quietly. But fate had a different plan. As Daniel passed a tray of drinks, a group near Sheikh Omar erupted into laughter. The sound wasn't joyful, it was sharp, cutting. Daniel glanced over, curiosity tugging at him. He realized with a sinking feeling that the laughter was directed at him. "Look at the cleaner's boy," someone whispered loudly enough to be heard. "He looks like he doesn't even belong in that suit." Daniel felt heat rise in his face, but he kept his head down, reminding himself of his mother's words. "Ignore it. Do your work. Don't give them a reason." But Sheikh Omar wasn't content with quiet mockery. He turned his sharp gaze on Daniel and smirked. "Tell me, boy," Omar said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "what could you possibly understand in a room like this? These are conversations of business, of power, not for children of cleaners." The crowd chuckled, some nervously, others with open amusement. Grace froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to shield her son, to tell Omar to leave, him alone, but she knew her words would carry no weight here. Worse, they might cost her the job she desperately needed. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the tray, but inside, something stirred. He was used to silence, used to being ignored. But ridicule, especially in front of his mother, was something else entirely. He glanced briefly at Grace, who gave him a subtle shake of the head. "Don't. Please don't." But Omar wasn't finished. He leaned closer, his voice dripping with mockery. "Tell me, boy, do you even understand what we are saying? Or do you just stand there, nodding like a servant waiting for scraps?" The group around him laughed again, and in that moment, Daniel felt the weight of every dismissal, every whisper, every time he and his mother were treated as though they were invisible. And though he said nothing yet, the fire in his eyes gave away the truth. This night would not end the way Omar expected. The laughter rolled through the marble ballroom like a cruel echo, bouncing from one crystal chandelier to another. Grace stood frozen, clutching the hem of her uniform, silently, begging for the moment to pass. Daniel lowered his eyes, but behind his lashes fire smoldered. He could endure being ignored. He had endured it his entire life. But what cut deep was seeing his mother's dignity mocked in the reflection of their laughter. To them, she wasn't Grace Johnson, a woman who worked tirelessly to keep food on the table. To them, she was just the cleaner. And by extension, Daniel was nothing more than her shadow. But Daniel's silence didn't end the ridicule. It fed it. Sheikh Omar smirked, emboldened by the lack of response. "You see, my friends," Omar said, gesturing broadly at the boy holding the tray of drinks. "This is what separates the rulers of the world from the cleaners of the world. Knowledge, power, language, these are things inherited by bloodlines, not plucked from the street." The crowd tittered, nodding in approval. It was the kind of room that followed the lead of the loudest voice, and tonight that voice belonged to Omar. Daniel's chest rose and fell with measured breaths. He wanted to shout the truth, that he understood everything Omar and his companions were saying, and more, that he could not only follow their conversations, but contribute in languages Omar himself likely couldn't speak. But he didn't. Not yet. Because Daniel knew something Omar didn't. Timing was everything. The first crack appeared when Omar switched tongues. He turned from English to French, laughing as he said, "Regardez ce garçon. Il ne comprend même pas ce que je..." Look at this boy. He doesn't even understand what I'm saying. The group laughed harder, this time in French, certain they had drawn a sharper line between themselves and the boy. But Daniel's eyes flickered. He had understood every word. In fact, he could have responded with ease. His lips pressed into a tight line. Not yet. Let them laugh a little longer. Let them believe in their own superiority until the moment their laughter turned to ash. Grace, watching from the edge of the room, wanted desperately to pull her son away, but something in his stance made her hesitate. His back was straight, his gaze steady, even as he pretended not to understand. She recognized that look. It was the same one he had as a child, when he would stand in front of a puzzle too difficult for his age. He wouldn't move until he solved it. Tonight, the puzzle was not made of pieces but of arrogance, and Daniel was already arranging the edges. Omar, relishing the attention, continued his game. He spoke to one guest in Italian, then shifted seamlessly to Arabic, each time glancing at Daniel with a sneer. How could a boy like this ever hope to grasp the intricacies of culture, of diplomacy, of business? He is destined to clean up after greatness, not achieve it. The men around him nodded, murmuring words of agreement in a dozen accents. They believed Omar represented authority, intelligence, and refinement. But Daniel knew better. He could hear Omar's Italian mispronunciations, the stiffness of his Arabic phrasing. Omar didn't master these languages. He used them as props. And Daniel? Daniel lived in them. The first moment of disruption came not from Daniel, but from one of the wives seated nearby. Draped in silk, she leaned toward her husband and whispered in halting French, struggling to keep up with Omar's boastful flow. She stumbled over a phrase, her cheeks coloring as she admitted, "I wish I could follow." For the first time, Daniel's restraint cracked. He set down his tray, leaned just slightly, and whispered the correct translation in flawless French, his tone respectful but confident. The woman blinked, startled. Her husband glanced at Daniel sharply. Around them, a few guests paused, uncertain if they had truly heard the cleaner's son speak with such precision. Daniel straightened quickly, stepping back as though nothing had happened. But the seed had been planted. Omar noticed the flicker of attention and turned his glare on Daniel. "Did you say something, boy?" he demanded. Daniel shook his head. "Just helping," he murmured softly. "Helping?" Omar barked out a laugh. "You think you can help here? This is a conversation of intellect, not servitude." But the guests were no longer fully laughing. They were curious now. They had heard something in Daniel's voice, confidence, fluency, an ease that could not be faked. Sensing his audience slipping, Omar decided to escalate. He turned to the boy directly this time. "Fine," he sneered. "Tell me then, boy. Do you even know what language I just spoke?" The ballroom fell silent. Daniel looked at him calmly. "Italian," he said, "though your pronunciation of ragazzo was incorrect. You rolled the R too harshly." A stunned pause. A few heads turned sharply, surprise flashing across their faces. The boy had not only recognized the language, but corrected it with the ease of a scholar. Omar's jaw tightened, but he forced a laugh. "A lucky guess," he said dismissively. "Anyone could recognize that." But Daniel didn't flinch. "It wasn't a guess," he said, his voice steady. "And I didn't just recognize it. I understood it. just as I understood your French. And your Arabic. The silence in the ballroom thickened. Grace's breath caught in her throat. For the first time all evening, Omar looked unsettled. You understand Arabic? Daniel nodded once. Then, without hesitation, he spoke, clear, fluid Arabic that carried across the room. Language is not inherited by bloodlines. It is earned by effort, by discipline, by will. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some clapped their hands to their mouths, others exchanged shocked glances. The cleaner's son had just spoken one of the world's most difficult languages with eloquence and authority. But Daniel wasn't finished. He switched smoothly into French. And those who mock others often reveal their own ignorance. Then into Italian. Respect is not given to the powerful. It is earned by the wise. Each phrase landed like a thunderclap. Each language was a strike dismantling Omar's pedestal. The guests leaned forward, captivated, drawn into the spectacle of a boy they had dismissed revealing himself as a polyglot prodigy. Grace's eyes blurred with tears. Her son, who had spent countless nights alone with books borrowed from the library, who had whispered foreign words into the dark until they became second nature, was now standing in the heart of a room that had mocked him, and he was undeniable. But Omar, humiliated, could not accept it. His face flushed with anger as he snapped, "Parlor tricks, that's all this is. A monkey repeating sounds. You think this makes you equal to me?" The crowd murmured uneasily. Omar's words, once sharp with authority, now rang hollow. The boy hadn't just repeated sounds. He had spoken with meaning, with substance. Still, the tension rose, because Daniel hadn't yet revealed the full scope of his brilliance. Daniel met Omar's eyes. "I don't speak sounds," he said evenly. "I speak 9 languages, and every one of them tells me the same thing. Arrogance speaks the loudest, when it has the least to say." The room erupted, not with laughter this time, but with gasps and whispers. 9 languages. The number hung in the air like a thundercloud ready to burst. Omar froze, his smirk vanishing. For the first time all evening, it was not Daniel standing small in the shadow of wealth. It was Omar, exposed beneath, the weight of a truth he couldn't refute. And yet this was only the beginning. Because what Daniel was about to do next would not only silence the laughter, but turn the entire ballroom against its self-proclaimed ruler. The number hung in the air like a thunderclap. 9. 9 languages. It wasn't a boast made lightly. It was a declaration that demanded proof. And every single person in that gilded ballroom leaned forward, waiting for the proof that could either crown Daniel or crush him. Omar tried to laugh, but the sound rang brittle, hollow, forced. 9 languages. Do you expect us to believe such a fairy tale? You're nothing but the son of a cleaning woman. Your place is to sweep floors, not to lecture scholars. But his words no longer carried the effortless weight of authority. Guests who once laughed at his every jab now exchanged uneasy glances. They had heard Daniel's fluency. They had felt the conviction behind his words. Curiosity had taken root, and Omar's denial sounded more like fear than truth. Daniel didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his posture steady, his gaze calm but unyielding. "You want proof?" he asked, his voice carrying across the marble floor. "Very well." He began not with Arabic, French or Italian, languages already displayed, but with German. His words cut through the air, sharp and precise. Respekt kann man nicht kaufen. Man verdient ihn durch Taten, nicht durch Reichtum. Respect cannot be bought. It is earned through actions, not wealth. A guest from Berlin, startled, straightened in his chair. He nodded vigorously, eyes wide. "Perfect," he whispered. Astonished. Without pause, Daniel shifted into Mandarin Chinese, his tones clear, confident, and measured. 智慧来自努力，而不是出身. Wisdom comes from effort, not from birth. The Chinese ambassador's wife gasped audibly, her hand flying to her lips. "Flawless," she murmured in disbelief. By now, the ballroom had fallen utterly silent, save for the reverberation of Daniel's voice. The boy they had mocked as nothing more than the cleaner's son was weaving languages like a conductor guiding a symphony. He continued, Portuguese next, then Russian, then Japanese, each delivered with a natural fluency that stripped away any last remnants of doubt. Every sentence was not just words, but lessons, truths crafted to strike at Omar's arrogance, messages about humility, discipline, respect, and the emptiness of pride. Each language landed like a hammer blow. Each guest who understood nodded, murmured, or gasped. And those who didn't understand still felt the electricity, the rhythm, the authority of his delivery. By the seventh language, Omar's face was pale beneath his tan. Sweat prickled his brow. He had been cornered in the very game he started, dismantled by the boy he thought too small to matter. But Daniel wasn't finished. He saved the final blow for last. He switched effortlessly back into English, his voice rising with clarity and force. I speak 9 languages. Not because of privilege, not because of wealth, not because I was born into luxury. I speak them because my mother taught me that the mind is limitless if you feed it, that effort carves paths where bloodlines cannot. You mocked her work, her sacrifices, but it was those sacrifices that gave me this power. The ballroom erupted, not with laughter this time, but with thunderous applause. Guests stood from their seats, clapping, cheering, their eyes wide with respect and awe. Some shouted "Bravo!" Others simply stared, stunned into silence by the transformation of a boy into a master. Grace stood at the edge of the crowd, tears streaming down her face. For years, she had endured the quiet humiliation of being invisible, of being the cleaner. No one noticed. Tonight, her son had lifted her higher than any title could. She wasn't just the woman who scrubbed their floors. She was the mother of brilliance. Omar tried desperately to salvage his pride. He raised his hands, shouting over the noise. Parlor tricks. This means nothing. Do you think speaking languages makes you powerful? Power comes from wealth, from control, from birthright. But the crowd no longer followed him. They looked at him now not as a leader, but as a desperate man unraveling in the shadow of a boy he mocked. The more he shouted, the smaller he appeared. Daniel, calm and composed, turned to face him directly. His words were steady, each syllable cutting like a blade. Power is not control, Omar. True power is knowledge, and knowledge has no bloodline. Tonight, everyone here has seen which one of us carries it. The applause surged louder, echoing off the marble and crystal until it drowned out Omar's protests completely. One guest, a distinguished diplomat, stepped forward. He looked Daniel over with sharp, appraising eyes before nodding with deep respect. A prodigy, he declared, a young man who will go far beyond these walls. His words rippled through the crowd, solidifying the shift. Others followed, approaching Daniel, shaking his hand, congratulating Grace. The tide had turned entirely. Omar stood alone, stripped of his audience, his arrogance crumbling in the silence of his isolation. The humiliation was complete. Omar's smirk was gone, his words faltering. He tried one last desperate sneer. You'll always be nothing more than the son of a servant. But this time the room didn't laugh. They didn't nod. They didn't even look at him. The words fell flat, lifeless, drowned beneath the roaring tide of respect now directed at Daniel. Daniel didn't respond with anger. He didn't need to. He simply looked at Omar with calm finality and said, Then remember this. Today, the servant's son taught the millionaire what true wealth is. The final line hit harder than any insult could. Omar flinched, his mouth snapping shut. Around him, no one spoke. No one defended him. The silence itself was his punishment. Daniel stood taller than ever, surrounded not by mockery, but by admiration. Grace pressed her hands to her mouth, trembling with pride. For years, she had carried shame on her shoulders like a burden. Tonight, her son had lifted it away with a brilliance that no one in that ballroom would ever forget. The climax had arrived, and in that single moment the hierarchy shifted. The boy they dismissed as the cleaner's son had become the star of the evening, and the millionaire who mocked him was reduced to a bitter shadow. And yet, as applause thundered and Omar's humiliation deepened, the story wasn't finished. Because what Daniel and Grace would take away from this night wasn't just vindication, it was a future rewritten. The ballroom slowly quieted after the storm of applause, but the silence wasn't the same one that had greeted Grace and Daniel. At the start of the evening, a silence of judgment, dismissal, and quiet cruelty. No, this silence was heavy with awe, with respect, with the kind of weight that came only after witnessing something extraordinary. Daniel, standing in the very center of it all, felt the world tilt. For years, he had been invisible, a boy overlooked, dismissed because of his mother's work, because of the color of their skin, because of where they came from. But tonight, in this glittering palace of marble and gold, no one could overlook him again. Grace, her heart pounding in her chest, could hardly believe it. Just hours ago, she had adjusted her apron and tied her headscarf, preparing to blend into the shadows, to endure another night of whispered ridicule while scrubbing the edges of wealth she would never taste. And now she stood in the light, her son's brilliance shining on her too. She wiped her eyes, but the tears kept coming, tears of pride, of release, of a vindication that no one could ever take away. But while Daniel and Grace basked in that moment of triumph, Omar, the once untouchable millionaire, was unraveling. He lingered near the edge of the room, his champagne glass trembling in his hand. The laughter he had once commanded so easily was gone. The guests who used to hang on his every insult avoided his eyes, slipping past him without acknowledgement. In a single evening, his dominance had been dismantled, and worse, it had been dismantled by the very person he mocked as the cleaner's boy. That humiliation would haunt him. The invitations. Begin after the applause died down. The real shift began. The same guests who had laughed at Daniel earlier now crowded around him, eager to shake his hand, to speak with him, to draw even a shred of his brilliance into their orbit. Diplomats offered him invitations to international forums. Scholars whispered about scholarships. A university representative from Oxford himself leaned down to Grace and said, "Your son has a place with us, whenever he wishes to claim it." Grace stood stunned, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles turned white. These were doors she had never dared imagine would open for her son. Doors she thought reserved only for the privileged, the powerful, the children born into silk sheets and diamond cradles. And yet here they were, swinging wide because Daniel had forced them open with his mind, his discipline, his fire. Daniel accepted the congratulations with humility. He bowed his head, thanked people in their own languages, earning gasps of delight, but never once did he gloat. The boy who had been laughed at knew that arrogance was a poison. His power wasn't to crush others beneath his heel. It was to rise so high they had no choice but to look up. Omar watched this with clenched fists. He saw the guests who once adored him now fawn over Daniel, and it was unbearable. His face darkened, his jaw tightened, and for the first time in years, he realized that his money couldn't buy him what Daniel had earned with effort, respect. Grace's redemption. When the guests finally began to drift away, many approached Grace, no longer treating her like the invisible woman with the mop. They shook her hand. They called her Madam. Some even apologized, subtle, stammered words of regret for the years of condescension. Grace didn't need their apologies. She had never asked for their approval, but she accepted the handshakes with dignity, her head held higher than ever. For once, she wasn't just the cleaning lady. She wasn't just a shadow on the marble floor. She was the mother of Daniel, the boy who had stunned the room, who had turned laughter into thunderous applause. She remembered the years she had carried her son to the library after long shifts, her back aching, her hands blistered, whispering to him among the shelves, "This is where your wealth will be found, Daniel. Not in money, but in words, in knowledge. They cannot take this from you." And now, in front of the very people who had dismissed her, she had proof that her sacrifices had been worth every tear, every night spent scrubbing. Omar's folded. While Daniel and Grace's stars rose, Omar's began to plummet. His humiliation became the whispered story of the season. Behind gilded doors and crystal chandeliers, guests repeated it again and again. How the arrogant millionaire had mocked the son of a cleaning woman, only to be destroyed in front of everyone. The story grew wings, spreading through business, circles, social clubs, and diplomatic dinners. Soon, Omar found himself the butt of the joke he had tried to make of Daniel. Invitations that once flooded his inbox began to thin. His name, once said with respect, now carried a smirk, a hint of mockery. His empire didn't crumble overnight, but reputation was a currency in his world, and his had been devalued beyond repair. And every time he heard Daniel's name whispered with awe, every time he saw Grace walk through the community with her, head high, he felt the burn of his own downfall. Daniel's new path for Daniel, the aftermath was more than vindication, it was transformation. The boy who studied by dim lamplight while his mother scrubbed floors now found himself surrounded by opportunity. Universities, internships, fellowships, all laid themselves at his feet. But Daniel didn't rush. He understood something vital. What had given him power that night wasn't just his languages, it was his discipline. And discipline meant choosing carefully. He decided to pursue linguistics and diplomacy, determined to use his gift not just to impress, but to build bridges between people. If language can humble a millionaire, he thought, it can also unite nations. Grace supported him every step of the way, her pride swelling with every letter of acceptance that arrived. She no longer wore her uniform with shame. Instead, she wore it with quiet dignity, knowing that her son had elevated them both. The ripple of respect. The community never looked at Grace the same way again. Where once she had been invisible, now neighbors greeted her warmly. Shopkeepers, who once overlooked her, now treated her with respect. Her employers, those who once ignored her presence, now whispered in hushed tones about her son's genius. But Grace remained grounded. She didn't need their sudden respect to define her worth. She knew her value all along. What changed was that now the world had no choice but to see it too. Omar's final encounter months later, fate delivered one last moment of reckoning. Omar, desperate to regain some semblance of influence, attempted to host another gala. But the turnout was thin, the air different. The old power he wielded with laughter and money had vanished. Daniel and Grace did not attend, though they were invited. Their absence spoke louder than their presence ever could. And Omar knew it. Knew that his greatest humiliation wasn't that Daniel had spoken 9 languages that night, but that Daniel had moved on to a world far greater, leaving Omar trapped in his own bitterness. He was a man who had mocked a cleaner's son and been undone by him, and that would be his legacy. The takeaway Daniel's story became a legend of sorts, retold in schools, whispered in communities, carried like a torch of hope. It wasn't just about languages, or humiliation, or revenge. It was about something deeper. The truth that brilliance could be born anywhere, that respect was earned, not inherited, and that arrogance always carried the seeds of its own downfall. For Grace, it was the vindication of every hardship. For Daniel, it was the beginning of a life defined not by where he came from, but by how far he could go. And for Omar, it was the bitter reminder that wealth without wisdom is nothing but an empty echo. As the years passed, Daniel's name rose higher, his path brighter. But the words he spoke that night in the ballroom never faded. True power is knowledge, and knowledge has no bloodline.